Okay, everybody, welcome back to Philosophy for the People. We are joined by Dr. John Joy today, and this is the first time that Dr. Joy has been on the podcast, and we're going to talk about the atonement and St. Thomas Aquinas. Obviously, this is sort of the realm of theology, but as we often discover, theology and philosophy have many points of deep and important intersection. It's not always so easy to separate these things out. Plus, we're never shy to dive into matters of theology or philosophy for the people. But Dr. Joy, it is great to have you on the podcast. Since it is your first time here, if you wouldn't mind, could you just briefly introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? How'd you get interested in the atonement and all that good stuff?
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks for having me on, Pat. Let me see. So who am I? I am the Dean of Faculty at St. Ambrose Academy in Madison, Wisconsin. So that's my full-time work. I studied theology at Ave Maria College, and then at the International Theological Institute in Austria, and then I did a doctorate at the University of Fribourg. My studies broadly focused on St. Thomas Aquinas, so most of my coursework was heavily Thomistic. And then my doctoral research was on the magisterium. So a lot of the writing and speaking that I've done over the last several years has been on the topic of the magisterium. That's become sort of my specialty, if you will. But my interests broadly are really just the theology and philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas more generally. So the topic of the atonement is a good one for me to get away from the magisterium for a while and not talk about something else, something maybe even a little more interesting, a little more fundamental to the Catholic faith. My interest in the topic goes way back. Before I even went off to grad school, I spent a couple years working in a little Catholic parish as a director of religious education. Yeah. And so I was teaching catechism classes. I was teaching RCIA for adults. And every time it came to teaching the central mystery of our salvation, or at least one of them, I suppose you could say Trinity, Incarnation, and the Atonement are the big three. I just got very frustrated how many Catholic books, Catholic authors, Catholic speakers seemed to be presenting the understanding of the atonement really drawn from the Protestant reformers. So a penal substitution view of the atonement, which just didn't sit well with me. It didn't check out. It left me uncomfortable in a number of ways that I'm sure we can get into. Sure. So one of the first things when I went to grad school that I was interested in sort of digging into more deeply was the understanding of the atonement, to see what the Catholic view really was, and to see if it's firmly grounded in the sources of the faith. And so studying St. Thomas Aquinas generally, and then investigating that topic, eventually led to this book that's come out just recently on the atoning death of Christ. So that's a little bit of who I am and what I'm up to, I think.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. So we'll start at kind of square one, and we'll build out from there. So the atonement itself, at one minute, what is this exactly? And like in the most broad sense of the term, what are we trying to think about? What is the doctrine of the atonement? And then also, if you wouldn't mind, just for because there will be people listening to this podcast coming from many different backgrounds, what do you think are some of like the most pressing or most important kind of deeper philosophical issues that are sort of naturally entwined when trying to work through competing theories of the atonement? So yeah, two things for you there. Take them in whatever order you want.
Sure. Well, let me come back to the philosophy bit in a second. So what is the atonement? What are we talking about? Is a good place to start. I think it was Frank Sheed pointed out that it's one of the very few, maybe the only sort of theological words originally coined in English. So at atonement, the word atonement, as you mentioned, at one meant. So it expresses the idea of reconciliation, of returning to unity after there's been a rupture or a break of some kind. So you can think about this in human relationships as well, but obviously with respect to God, we're talking about the rupture caused by Adam and Eve's original sin, estranging the human race from God. And then the work of atonement is the work that Christ accomplishes in order to bring us back to unity, to oneness with God. So in Scripture, it's reconciliation is how it's often put in the New Testament, the work of reconciliation, which comes more or less to the same thing. So the theology of the atonement is the field of theology that tries to answer the question, how did Christ's death on the cross save us? So the New Testament is crystal clear that Christ's death on the cross is what accomplished our salvation, is what reconciles us to God the Father, and so on. But it's never spelled out in any kind of detail or great clarity exactly how that works.
Yes.
There are certainly hints, and there's a lot of reference back to Old Testament types that allow you to that give you a lot of material to work with to try to answer this question. But that's the question: how is it that this brutal death, which to all appearances is just a criminal execution, how does that accomplish our reconciliation with God? And then where does that intersect with philosophy? Maybe you could come up with more ways, but the one that jumps out to me most strongly is the question of justice. So the question of what is justice is obviously a deeply philosophical question and a very important one. And then kind of justice with respect to God is its own sort of special branch of philosophy, you could say. I mean, because you could think about that obviously in terms of a natural theology, which is still philosophical. What does the nature of God, philosophically considered, demand in terms of His justice and things like that? But then, so you're dealing with the biblical evidence that theology works with to try to answer the question. But then you also have to have a philosophical understanding of the nature of God and His goodness and His justice. And so whatever answer you come up with to that question of how does Christ's death save us needs to be able to adequately satisfy both your theological and your philosophical requirements, right? Because if your theology came up with an answer that made God turn out to be some kind of monstrous figure who just delights in death and bloodshed,
right,
which is not the picture of God that we get from a sound philosophy, then we would have to think that our theology has gone astray.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that good philosophy puts certain constraints, including moral constraints, right, on or boundaries, right, of how we work out the theology. And like you, there were certain theories of the atonement that I just found completely incompatible with, I think, not just common sense, but properly thought through notions of justice and mercy and love and stuff like that. So whatever the correct theory is, I felt pretty confident saying it isn't in this direction or that direction or whatnot. So very good, right? That's a great, concise introduction. Dr. Troy, I've sometimes kind of heard the problem presented this way, and I'll just kind of get your thoughts if you think this is a helpful framing. If not, then we can just skip past it. But sometimes I've heard philosophers and theologians think about trying to figure out what side is the problem on when it comes. So the problem is that there's this estrangement. There's been this distancing between humanity and God. What side is the problem on? Is the problem on the side of God? Is it something about sort of God's nature, his dignity, whatever, that he can't just snap his fingers and forgive us or something, that something really has to sort of be repaid to satisfy whatever that constraint is? Or is the problem on our side? There's something about us, the state of our psyche, will, whatever it might be, right? That God has to try and work around or through or to overcome or something like that. Or maybe it's both. But one can probably see that if you go on one side or the other where you think the fundamental issue of this reconciliation is, where the block is, you might answer, your theory might be answered in quite different ways, if that makes sense. So I'd be curious, do you think that framing is at all helpful, or would you frame it differently before we start to investigate?
I think that is helpful. I think that can help you see where some of the divergences come from. I think the reformers, Luther and Calvin, when I say that, I mean Luther and Calvin specifically, because I know there are many variations amongst, in Protestantism in general. I think tended to approach it from the point of view of the problem being on God's side, so to speak. I doubt they would have put it in those terms. But especially in Calvin, maybe there's a great emphasis on kind of what God's justice demands of him. So his own justice requires him to take a certain response. And the penal substitution view of the atonement, I think, lays a heavy emphasis on that. Aquinas's doctrine of the atonement is quite different than that. So Aquinas views the problem as being really on our side, entirely on our side. I mean, so Aquinas says, yeah, God could have snapped his fingers and just granted a blanket amnesty, so to speak. I mean, he could have just said, that's all right, chaps, let's just
Bygones be
reset and try
bygones.
again. Yeah.
Right.
Like we do with our kids sometimes, you tell them, don't eat that, we're saving that for dessert. Kid eats it. Every parent's got that moment where he's like, all right, we lay down the law, or sometimes, depending on the day, you're like, okay, fine, whatever, just don't do it again.
Right.
So St. Thomas is a great defender of God's freedom, omnipotence, his impassibility. I mean, that God is not affected intrinsically by our actions. I mean, I know that sounds deeply impersonal, which it's really not. But it's a focus on God's freedom and omnipotence, especially. So St. Thomas sees the problem really on our side. So if God could have saved us by a snap of his fingers, so to speak, why did he choose the path he took, which is so much more arduous, even for himself, becoming man and then dying horribly on the cross? And if you see it then as he's doing all of that in order to bring about some kind of healing internally in us that we needed to experience for our good, you get a very different picture of what's going on in the crucifixion.
Yeah. One thing I know we're going to focus on penal substitution here in a minute. Maybe this would be a good kind of segue into it. But when I was thinking, and I'm not a specialist on theories of atonement, I've read a fair amount, but mostly to the extent that they intersect with my wider philosophical interests, one of which is the problem of pain and the problem of suffering, right? And I think that's important because I think some theories of the atonement really close off options of how to respond philosophically to the problem of suffering, right? They don't seem to leave much of a role for suffering to play, right, in our lives. Whereas other theories of atonement are sort of have kind of incorporate a providence of suffering in the grander scheme of reconciliation, justification, sanctification, stuff like that, right? I'd be curious if you think that's right. And for me, that's again a philosophical project of systematicity, right? How does everything sort of hang together here, right? But also when it maybe I'll just pause there and kind of get your thoughts. Right? This is part of the difficulty of philosophical theology in general. Is like, okay, we might think we have a neat solution at this moment, but then when we see, okay, how does this connect with or incorporate other things that we've tried to kind of find resolutions to, and it doesn't, then you have an issue, right? So yeah, sorry, I just kind of dropped some random stuff there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Maybe it'll be most helpful to sort of lay out what penal substitution is and then try to contrast St. Thomas's view with it. And then return to this question about the role of our suffering that the two different theories result in. So let me mention as well, I'm also not a specialist in the atonement per se. So I'm more of a specialist in St. Thomas Aquinas' thought in general. So I know his doctrine of the atonement fairly well. And then in the book here, I contrast his theory specifically against Saint Anselm, a predecessor in the Catholic theology movement of scholasticism on the one side, and then Luther and Calvin on the other. I touch on some other theories much more briefly in the book. So I won't claim to be able to comment on all theories. I can speak mostly to Aquinas and then contrast to the reformers a bit. But I think there is a big difference, like you say, in the role that leaves for our kind of redemptive suffering on the other side, so to speak. But maybe we'll try to see that.
We could try and connect that later. But go ahead and start laying out some of the whatever you
Yeah.
want.
So so Luther and Calvin, first of all, so the penal substitution view of the atonement, I think, is fairly well known. I mean, because it's the kind of view that's sort of in the popular psyche, so to speak, a little bit. It's basically the idea that human beings sinned, and so needed to be punished. God the Father is angry over the sins of humankind, and so is going to punish the human race. But that Christ steps in and says, I'll take the punishment, and the Father agrees to that, and so punishes Christ instead of us, leaving us scot-free. So the way Luther expresses it, it's the flip side of his doctrine of justification. So it really is an integral doctrine to the Reformation, but it doesn't get nearly as much attention as Luther's idea of justification by faith alone.
Mhm.
But his understanding of justification by faith alone is that we receive, although sinful and remaining sinful, we nevertheless are given the rewards of Christ's justice. The flip side of that is that Christ, although sinless and remaining sinless, receives the punishment due to our sin. So Luther understands this to be a swapping of places, an exchange of persons between the sinless Christ and the sinful humanity, so that the rewards of our sin, so to speak, the punishment for our sin, are given to him, even though he's sinless, and the reward for his righteousness is given to us, even though sinful. So justification by faith alone and penal substitution are the two sides of the same coin.
Right.
So it's very sorry, side comment. It's distressing and confusing how deeply penal substitution has actually penetrated Catholic thinking. How many Catholics are hold to this theory without reflecting on it very, very well. I suspect it's because the controversies focused so much on the justification by faith alone that the other side of the coin was just left somewhat unaddressed.
Sure. Yeah.
So an easy way to illustrate this idea is perhaps the example of Saint Maximilian Kolbe. If your listeners are familiar with him, he's a priest in a Nazi prison camp. The Gestapo decide to execute 10 people at random, and one of those whom they choose starts pleading, that he has a wife, he has a family, to allow him to live. And Maximilian, who's a fellow prisoner who had not been selected, steps forward and says, I'll take this man's place. You can kill me instead of him. And the exchange was accepted by the Nazi guards, and the man whom Maximilian saved lived through the war and came home to his family. I mean, it's a beautiful, moving story, and it's one of the reasons why Saint Maximilian is such a well-beloved saint in the Catholic Church. So if you think of, so penal substitution pictures Christ's work of saving mankind similar to what Maximilian did, where God the Father is going to punish the human race, and Jesus steps in and says, why don't you punish me in their place? And so God the Father allows us to get off scot-free. Now, one of the problems that I hope you can see pretty quickly with that scenario is although it paints Jesus in a very sympathetic light as this heroic Maximilian Kolbe figure stepping in to take the punishment, it does leave God the Father looking an awful lot like the Nazi Gestapo, which is not really an image of God the Father that you want to have. That's not going to be good.
That you should have.
No, definitely not. It's but I'm afraid it's the image of God the Father that a lot of people do have, a kind of vengeful, angry, hungry for punishment, kind of scary authority figure in the sky. And the penal substitution theory of the atonement just sort of feeds that.
This is where I actually have a fair amount of sympathy with even some of the most crude atheistic memes. And you've seen memes that effectively parody this. And okay, they're a little cartoonish, but not that cartoonish, honestly, at the end of the day. Cards on the table, right? When I was first examining Christianity and looking at the sort of this option, it was pretty quickly off the table right away, right?
Yeah.
Because of those sort of background philosophical constraints that I already had, right?
Right.
Yeah. So sorry, but little interjection there. But continue.
No, that's quite all right. So, so then to contrast Thomas Aquinas a little bit. So one thing that I just want to say again, because it's a strong point of contrast with Aquinas, is to see that in the Reformers' view, Christ and the human race change places, whereas for Saint Thomas, they're going to be united. So for Saint Thomas, the incarnation is central to the atonement, right? So it's all about God becoming man, Christ becoming a man, and then uniting us to himself. So the idea of incorporation that you have all throughout St. Paul as well, that Christians are meant to become members of the body of Christ, is understood in a very strong sense, that we are the human race is called into unity with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not doing something on the cross apart from us so that we don't have to do it.
Yes.
He's doing something on the cross in order to draw us into himself, so that whatever he's doing, we can do it too with him and in him. And that's where the role of redemptive suffering in the life of the Christian comes so strongly into play, which you don't have in Luther and Calvin. So for Luther and Calvin, we're just trying to escape the suffering and punishment that's due to us for our sin, and Christ is taking it so we don't have to. And then it's left a bit mysterious, maybe why you still have to suffer so much in this life, and what the reason for that could be. Whereas for Aquinas, whatever it is he's doing on the cross, he wants us to be doing with him, which means it's not him taking on himself something so that we can avoid that thing. So maybe that doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet,
no,
though.
it does, but also, would you say it's fair to say, because that is the best or only available means to achieve that sort of internal or psychic reintegration that's necessary for the mutual indwelling between human beings and God?
Yeah, I think that's right. So St. Thomas Aquinas I'm going to take this back a couple of steps now. So where he kind of develops the roots of his understanding of the atonement, he describes the atonement as a work of satisfaction, which he his Latin term is that he uses consistently is pena satisfactoria, satisfactory punishment or satisfactory pain. And the roots of his understanding of that come out of his understanding of penance. So if you start digging into Aquinas's theology here, you look first to his teaching on the cross. How did Christ's death save us? But pretty quickly, as you read backwards, so to speak, and follow out the footnotes and things like that, you come into his treatment of the sacrament of penance, the sacrament of confession, because what he understands Christ to be doing, in a way, is doing penance for us, as opposed to being punished for us. And those are closely related. So in Latin, pena means punishment, and our term pain comes from that. And penitentia is penance. So penance is a kind of punishment, but with some important differences from punishment, simply speaking. So if you can think of the difference between the two very, very clearly in human experience. So I like giving the example of offending my wife, right? So if I do something,
we've never done this
unintentionally most of the time, I promise. But if I've done something to hurt my wife in some fashion, right? If I've offended her in some way, there are two ways. There are two ways to bring justice to the situation, right? So justice requires some kind of equality, a kind of restoration of order between the two. So if I've offended my wife, she can restore justice in a way by punishing me in some fashion, right? So she makes me sleep on the couch or whatever. Now that sort of equalizes the relationship again, but it doesn't restore the friendship. That should be really clear, right? It sort of confirms the alienation or the loss of friendship between the two. Or the other way that justice can be restored is if I go buy her flowers and chocolates and come back and repent and try to make up for what I've done. That's penance. So there's punishment is when the offended party gets even by injuring the one from whom they were injured, right? So there's a restoration of justice, but not friendship. Penance is when the one who sinned does something positively good for the offended party in order to try to make up for it. So instead of I bring you down, and so you bring me down, and then we're even again. The alternative way of restoring justice, if I bring you down, so to speak, I can do something to try to raise you back up.
Right.
And then justice is restored, that equality of justice, and the friendship is also restored, which is a huge difference, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Very nice
uh,
illustration.
Another example that I like to give is, right, is if I come over with my baseball bat and smash out all the windows of your car, what are the two ways of dealing with this problem? Punishment would say, well, you're going to grab your baseball bat and come smash out all the windows in my car and probably slash the tires as well, right? Whereas penance is I take the initiative, I recognize that I've done something wrong, I approach you repentantly, and buy you a new car, right? Or pay to have the windows repaired. So I make up for the offense somehow. So that notion of punishment is what the reformers are dealing with. That notion of penance is what Thomas Aquinas is dealing with. So what's happening on the cross is Christ being punished by God the Father. That's the reformers' view, the penal substitution view. Or is Christ doing penance for the human race on the cross? Now, I'm sorry, I'm rambling at a long,
No, this
for a long
is really
time.
good. No, this is
Interject me
all.
anytime you want.
No, this is all great stuff. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the insights that Saint Anselm brings to this picture. He's a couple centuries earlier than Saint Thomas. He's writing near the end of the 1000s, early 1100s, a century and a half before Saint Thomas. He says that in his work Cur Deus Homo, he points out the difficulty of the human race is that we owe this reparation. So we committed this offense against God. There are these two options, so to speak, from the point of view of justice. God could just punish us. We all go to hell. That's the end of the story. Or we need to make reparation somehow. We need to do penance. We need to bring the flowers and chocolates to God, so to speak, right? In order to restore not only justice, but also relationship.
Right.
But we don't have anything, because everything we have comes from God anyway. We don't really have anything that we can offer to him that would sufficiently make up for the offense of sin. And so he sees Christ stepping in that role, that Christ's death on the cross, because Christ is both God and man, the love with which he offers his life. So this is back to St. Thomas Aquinas now. He points out three reasons specifically why Christ's death is able to offer a compensation. So to do something as pleasing to God as our sin was displeasing. So if you think of the scales of justice, the sin of the human race is on one side. The reformers are trying to balance that out, the penal substitution view, by placing the pain Christ experiences on the other side. The punishment has to fit the crime. And that's how they're trying to balance out the scales.
Yeah.
St. Thomas says, no, it's not, because it's not a matter of being punished for the sin. It's a matter of positively making reparation for the sin, doing something good in order to make up for what you've done wrong. And so what St. Thomas puts on the scale to counterbalance the weight of human sin are the infinitely pure and perfect love of Christ with which he goes to the cross, the infinitely precious life of a God-man which he offers, and the tremendous but not infinite extent of pain that he experiences. So the suffering has a role to play in the experience. And what is the role that suffering has to play? Why is suffering necessarily a part of penance, even if we're talking about penance, not punishment? So it's clear why you have to suffer when you're being punished, right? Why do you have to suffer in order to make reparation, in order to do penance. And this is where St. Thomas goes back into the human psychology, and you'll find this more in his treatment of the sacrament of penance. Why is penance necessary for us? And he says basically to restore internal balance, to restore psychological health. So he says by sinning, no matter what the sin, by sinning, you've indulged your will too much in the pursuit of pleasure. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily, right? We're not talking only about like you pursued a pleasure of the flesh, but you, if you're in any sin you commit, your will indulged itself in its own pleasure seeking somehow. And so he says to restore rectitude internally for you, you have to experience something painful. So he's viewing pain and pleasure as kind of the two things that push and pull the will, so to speak. If you've gone too far this way with indulging yourself in pleasurable activities, you got to be pulled back by experiencing something painful. So when you're doing penance, it does have to be painful, but it's not the pain that's being weighed against the sin, right? It's the love with which you're offering penance that's really being weighed against the sin. So think of me bringing flowers to my wife again. The flowers I bring her might not really make compensation in a purely objective sense. Like they might not be worth very much. But if I worked and sweated and pricked my hands on thorns, finding them and finding the ones she likes and offer them to her with great sincerity, then it is going to make that reparation, because the love with which you offer compensation counts for a great deal in the restoration of not only justice, but friendship. So the penance should be painful, Aquinas says, but the pain isn't doing all the work on its own. And so the pain doesn't have to be infinite to equal out the infinite debt of sin.
Yes.
The infinite love of Christ, undergoing something painful, certainly, is enough to make compensation for sin. So that's a really important point for avoiding some of the other big difficulties that penal substitution gets into.
Yeah, and if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to turn towards a few more of those.
Yeah.
Here, you had a thought you wanted to finish to.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so one of the difficulties you get into with penal substitution is, is this, that if Christ saves us by taking on himself the punishment that was due to us, well, then you got to stop and think, well, what punishment was actually due to us? It wasn't just physical death. It's actually eternal damnation, right? If you're looking at the biblical evidence here, it's not just physical death, it's eternal damnation. And so if his death is going to save us effectively from within the constraints of that theory, you're going to have to say, well, Christ then must have experienced eternal damnation and not only physical death. And that obviously raises problems from the point of view of eternity, because we know he only spends 3 days dead. He comes back, he ascends into heaven. So some penal substitution theorists try to compensate. Well, even if it didn't have eternity in duration, it must therefore have just had a kind of infinity in intensity. So he must have experienced the equivalent of eternal damnation, in the space of those 3 days he was dead. And so then the theology of like Christ's descent into hell, which is in the Apostles' Creed, right? That Christ dies, he descends to hell, and then he rises again and ascends to heaven. The way the reformers will interpret that kind of idea is that he really goes to hell to suffer the full pains of hell, whereas the Catholic tradition has always been that he descends to the realm of the underworld, so to speak, in order to rescue all those who had been held captive and lead them to heaven. So he's going to rescue Adam and Eve and Moses and David and Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and even his foster father, Saint Joseph and John the Baptist. That's what's going on there. So there are problems there. They come to a head when you really dig in and say, okay, what is the essential punishment of hell? And the traditional theological answer, I think the correct one, is that the essential punishment of hell, the real internal pain, is the separation from God. It's being ultimately cut off from God, who's the source of all life and all good. And then you have to ask, okay, so in what sense can Jesus Christ, who is God, then be separated in some kind of ultimate way from God? And here's where I love St. Thomas. When he comments on the Gospel of Matthew, Christ's cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yep.
He says, well, some people interpret this in a heretical way, as if Jesus were really, in some kind of metaphysical sense, separated from God. And he says, basically, at that point, take your pick, whether you want to be an Arian or an Nestorian.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if you accept that view, you can choose your heresy, but it's a heresy either way.
But you're
because,
stuck with one or the other, right? Yeah.
yeah, there's no escaping it. Because if you want to say Jesus is separated from God, you have to either say the Son, the second person of the Trinity, is radically separated from the Father, and then you're an Arian, you've destroyed the Trinity. Or you have to separate the humanity from the divinity in Christ, and then you're a Nestorian.
Right.
So take your pick. St. Thomas. So the way St. Thomas interprets that, this is a bit of a side note, I guess, is that how? So in what sense is Jesus abandoned by the Father? Then he says, well, it's common to speak of being abandoned by your friends. Let's say, anytime you're in trouble and your friends don't come to rescue you. Right? I mean, if you were being beat up in a dark alleyway and a few of your friends walked by, paused, looked at you, and walked on, you'd feel abandoned by them. And so he says, recall what Jesus says in the garden to St. Peter. He says, put up your sword when Peter tries to defend him. Don't you know that I could call on my Heavenly Father to send legions of angels to defend me? So that is something that God the Father could do, right? He could send legions of angels to rescue Christ from the crucifixion, and yet he doesn't, right? So Christ is abandoned to his fate, so to speak. So that abandonment is very real. Christ experiences that sense of being left to his fate, being not rescued by one who could rescue him. But there's no need to interpret. I mean, and the psychological pain of that would be very real, right, in Christ's human nature. But there's no need to posit a sort of a deep metaphysical rupture between the persons of the Trinity or between the humanity and divinity of Christ.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. So this is one of the issues with penal substitutions, but frankly, there's a lot. And as you say in your book, to be fair, people who defend this theory have responded, and in some cases adequately, to a number of these objections. But there's a handful that seem particularly difficult. You've just highlighted one. We talked about one earlier, which is it seems really hard to reconcile this with any coherent notion of actual justice and God's love. And of course, there are defenders of Aquinas' view who just say this is strictly incompatible with a God of love. But there's also seemed to be, maybe we could veer towards some of the, here's one, just off the top of my head real quick, is that, and I guess if somebody were to try to, maybe it wouldn't be too huge of a cost to get out of this, right? Because they could just deny something they might want to deny. But it seems like if you're going to take the view that we're criticizing and claim that Christ had to die because you needed this sort of infinite reparation for an infinite sin or something like that, that ultimately is going to have a consequence that's going to collapse pretty much any degree of sin, especially between venial and mortal. When any offense to God is going to be infinite if the offense is just kind of derived from the dignity of the person that it goes against, right? And that to me just also seems to be deeply problematic on many levels. But I guess the quick response to that would be from many people that's fine, because not everybody accepts the Catholic view of venial and mortal sins and stuff like that. But for me, that would be a cost, because that actually seems like a very correct view of thinking of the nature of offense and how things can more seriously separate indwelling and love and union between persons than other things. So I don't know, maybe you had a comment on that. Otherwise, we can leave that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I haven't run across anyone discussing that issue, so I can't really anticipate what the response in defense of it would be. So yeah, intriguing. I'd be interested to see anybody's thoughts who's put some thought into that. Another big one, I think, is the you're sort of left with a dilemma to choose between either universalism or a limited atonement, because
Yes.
one of the sort of logical consequences of the penal substitution view is if Christ has been punished for my sin already, then it seems kind of unjust for God to also punish me for it. So either I'm guaranteed salvation, or Christ didn't really die for my sins specifically. So you see the in the Protestant world, there, people take different options. So the Calvinist option was, well, Christ didn't die for everyone. He only died for the elect, and they're guaranteed salvation. So problem solved, no problem. But that doesn't sit well. The idea that Jesus only died for some doesn't sit well with a good bit of the biblical evidence.
Or just common moral sense.
Yeah, exactly right. Or a moral view of God. And so then the alternative is, well, if he died for everyone, but we're still understanding his death as being punished for everyone's sins, then it would be unjust for God to punish anyone's sins again, and so we must all just go to heaven. And I think that that's quite a popular view these days. That we must all just get to heaven, really, in the end, and that doesn't sit well with the biblical evidence either. Whereas if you follow Aquinas and say, no, what Christ is doing is an act of penance in order to make reparation for sin, in order to restore not only justice but also friendship with God, but that in order for that to be effective for us, we have to enter into it with him. Well, then those who enter into it with him are able to be saved, and those who don't aren't. So he dies for all. The invitation is there for all, and yet nevertheless there's still this room for not only room for, but a requirement of our cooperation that leads to some ultimately being saved and others not.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Were we missing any others? Because I remember I think you had 3 in your book, primary issues you brought up against the penal substitutionary account. Have we?
The third one we touched on briefly at the beginning, which maybe just didn't require much more elaboration. It's that it seems it's if this is all about justice, it seems pretty monstrously unjust for God the Father to punish an innocent person in our place. So punishing the innocent is contrary to justice, but voluntarily doing penance on behalf of a guilty one is not, because the initiative is wholly from the other side.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and I think that's right. I don't think that one needs to belabor that point too much. Some things I think are perfectly obvious on their face. Well, I know philosophers aren't supposed to say that, right?
Some things are
take every crazy scenario seriously, but honestly, I don't know. Maybe it's the gray that I'm getting in my beard. I just lose certain things these days. Okay, good. What else haven't we said about Thomas's theory? What other issues do you think that it solves? What other aspects? I mean, obviously, here's the deal. Like, I will straight up admit that, like, the penal substitutionary account, like, it is clean, it is convenient, it is neat, and it is wrong, right? Thomas's is complicated, right? It's considering a lot of different things, especially the nature of the human person, which itself is very complicated, right? There's a lot of different threads going on here. So I think it's not only harder to fully appreciate initially, so you have to kind of put more work in up front, and it's almost impossible, I think, to just like give a super, I think you've done actually a pretty great job, actually, like a super brief articulation of it. But I think if you really work with Aquinas's understanding here, okay, what might be a little bit more work up front is actually robustly satisfying in the end, both philosophically and theologically across the board. Maybe there's more moving parts and you got to connect more pieces, but the pieces actually do connect, I think, at the end of the day, into a coherent system, which is just not the case when we're considering the rival view. Do you think that's right, or am I just kind of
No, I agree with that.
I can't summarize Aquinas' account succinctly, right? I mean,
yeah,
I'm even thinking we won't mention her here because she's not here, but like Stump's book, I mean, essentially her from wandering to darkness to her latest book, each of which is like 600 to 800 pages, is like trying to get across Aquinas' theory of the atonement, right? Right? There's a lot here to try and understand, but it's connecting with so many different things, and scriptural data and tradition and philosophical anthropology and metaphysics and goodness and the metaphysics of love, and trying to weave it all together. And of course, if you're going to try and do something like that, you're probably going to have to spill a considerable amount of ink. So yeah, maybe we lose like the quick answer to like, how did this save us, right? But I think at the end we get a much better answer. Do you think that's right?
I think that is right. And to give credit again to the reformers, I mean, not only is it sort of quick and clear and clean and logical, there's a good number of verses that you can appeal to in Scripture that would seem at first glance to support it. I mean, so
Right.
there are things like Christ, who knew no sin, became sin for us, and you think, okay, he became sin. Now, that's a bit. There's not any coherent way to take that in a strictly literal sense. But if you try to take it as strictly literally as you can, it's going to lead you to something like, I mean, it's going to fuel a penal substitution kind of view. I think the better biblical exegesis is when he says something that actually just can't be taken in a literal sense. You should get a clue that there's something metaphorical going on here. Um, but the biblical record, speaks of Christ enduring the punishment of sin, right? He takes on himself the punishment of sin. And that's perfectly true. I mean, you read Genesis, what does God say to Adam and Eve? In the day that you eat the fruit, you'll die. The punishment for sin laid down at the very beginning of the Bible is death. You're going to die if you eat the sin. And so then it's perfectly true to say, well, Jesus took on himself the punishment for our sin, meaning he voluntarily died for us. But the whole difference, that so you can take that kind of at face value, and it'll lend itself to a penal substitution interpretation. But the whole question then is, well, okay, so he took on himself death, which is the punishment of sin, but did he take it on qua punishment, under the ratio of punishment? Did he take it on? Did he take death on himself as a punishment or as a penance? And that's that changes everything. So it's a very fine distinction almost between Aquinas and the Reformers. It's a very small distinction at the beginning, but then it leads to very, very, very different places. And if you trace them both all the way out, you're right. It takes a lot more work with Aquinas, but where you get to in the end is much more satisfactory, much more comprehensive. It accounts for more things. It ties more things together, and it does so in a way that respects human nature and kind of our psychology and what we need internally in order to be healed. It respects the divine nature, and it respects the biblical record. And I think maybe the fact that Aquinas and Anselm, I mean, in the Middle Ages, you've got 1,000 years of Catholic practice behind that, because where a lot of the analysis comes from, like I mentioned, is the understanding of the practice of the sacrament of penance. If that's deeply embedded in your psyche, let's say, as a medieval Catholic, I think Aquinas's account is going to be more intuitive. But the modern practice of penance for Catholics is, go say 3 Hail Marys, and that doesn't give you a full picture of what penance is really all about.
Yeah. Dr. John Joy, this has been a delight so far. Before we close out, are there any final points? Obviously, there's many aspects of this debate that we not only did not explore, but could not reasonably explore in an introductory conversation. So if there's any final points you want to make, please make them. Otherwise, please tell us, I have the book right here, about what else people can expect from your book, The Atoning Death of Christ, and where the best place to get it would be.
Sure. Well, on the book, I mean, you can get it from the publisher, Cruican Hill Press, or from Amazon.com, of course. What you should expect when you read it, it's a pretty slim volume. I mean, this is not meant to be the definitive, take on everything related to the atonement or even Aquinas. So it's an introduction to the topic. It's 80 some pages. It should give you hopefully a good, clear understanding of the basic differences between these three positions. St. Anselm of Canterbury, who's a doctor of the church, Catholic theologian, who kind of first outlines what St. Thomas Aquinas then later develops, and then Aquinas's theory, and then contrasted with the reformers. So hopefully you'll find it fairly easy to read and good introduction for seeing the different perspectives. And then, yeah, like you say, there are 600 to 800 page books you can follow up if you really want to dig deep on this kind of stuff. For one kind of closing remark, maybe on the contrast, I want to go back to the idea of Luther's exchange versus Thomas's idea of incorporation, because I think that sums up most clearly the radical difference. So if the cross is a matter of punishment, then Jesus is doing on the cross something. He's doing something, namely being punished, so that we don't have to do it, right? So that we don't have to be punished. He's doing something for us in the sense of he's doing it instead of us, so that we don't have to do it. But if what he's doing on the cross should be understood really as penance, as satisfaction, as Aquinas says, which is more like penance, then he's doing something on the cross for us in the sense that we weren't able to do it. We needed to do it. In order to be restored to friendship with God, we're going to have to do it. It's good for us to do it, but we just couldn't do it. So Christ is doing something on the cross for us in the sense that he's doing it so that we can be united to him, and then through him, with him, in him, be able to do it, right? So then what is the sacrifice of the Mass? It's our baptism incorporates us into Christ, unites us to him, and then at the Mass, that sacrifice is re-offered to God, and we offer ourselves to God in union with that sacrifice, so that our sufferings, our penances, our worship, all is taken up into that sacrificial offering, which is what we needed to do all the way along and simply had no means adequate of doing. So either Christ is doing something instead of us so that we don't have to, that's Luther's view, or he's doing something we needed to do but couldn't do so that with and in him we can finally do it. And that is so satisfying that now we can finally do the thing that we've always wanted to do, which is to worship God in justice with upright hearts.
Yeah, and to that I would say amen. Beautifully stated. The book is called The Atoning Death of Christ, St. Thomas's Doctrine of Vicarious Satisfaction by Dr. John P. Joy. I'll be sure to link it below. And Dr. Joy, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. This has been a delight.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Pat.